supposed to look? Okay, great. So thank you all for being here. My name is Sarah Koo. I'm an assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago. And I just started here in August, and so I'm new to Chicago. But I'm excited to share with you all about circular economies. So before I get into circular economies, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself, show you all sort of what I have done with my life so that you can see sort of where I'm coming from as somebody talking about this topic. So I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. I got my undergraduate degree in marketing. I spent almost a decade in industry, starting and running a medical device company. And that was really different from what I was sort of what I was interested in doing, but it gave me a lot of great experience there. And so I took a little bit of a shift, and I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with WOOFing, with the WOOF program. It stands for Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And it's a pretty interesting program and way to be able to travel really cheaply, because you basically go and work on a farm, you volunteer on a farm, and they house you and feed you for free. And so it's a pretty good exchange if you're wanting to travel cheaply. And so I was curious to do that, and also just to learn more about food. And so I went and volunteered at an aquaponics farm over a summer, and just became really fascinated with different types of sustainable and innovative agricultural methods. And so from there, I was wanting to do research on that topic, and quickly sort of shifted into a food waste space instead of a food space, because there are a lot of opportunities there to be able to not only reuse what we are what we're eating, but using the waste to then grow more food. And so having that be sort of a circular type of process. And so I became really fascinated with that, ended up going to grad school for that, and had my dissertation on looking at organizational food waste, because there's lots of waste that comes out of not just us as individual consumers, but also from companies and from different organizations. And so now here I am at Loyola. I'm teaching a couple of different courses this semester. One is specifically as an introduction to the circular economy. One is on sustainable business management, and one next semester will be on biomimicry and kind of systems thinking kind of a thing. So just wanted to give a little bit of a background of where I'm coming from, so you can see my sort of qualifications and credentials for this topic. And I always like to start out a talk with this little picture right here. I think it's a fantastic way to be able to frame waste as something that is very useful. Waste is only waste if you waste it. And so there's a lot of opportunities that can come out of that if we treat waste as a resource rather than as just something to be discarded. And, sort of the other catchy thing of one man's trash is another man's treasure. There's a lot of opportunities that can come with using waste as a resource. But there are also, of course, a lot of challenges there, because the value of certain materials, and certain waste materials in particular, can be very subjective, can be very culturally based. It can be dependent upon the processes that are available, the markets that are available, the equipment, the capabilities that we can handle these materials. So to sort of start getting into it, the circular economy, I'm taking a definition from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. This foundation is really a pretty big leader in the circular economy space, with providing, they have lots of, I'll share this slide deck after the presentation, and all of these links and the sources and things are clickable links, and so you'll be able to access those. But they have a lot of great resources and tools and activities and stuff like that. But just to sort of to start out, if we look at this definition, circular economy is about gradually decoupling economic activity from the consumption of finite resources and designing waste out of the system. Now, I've highlighted some of those words here because what we have been traditionally doing, which presumably y'all have talked about some in the class already, is that we've been operating in a linear economy where it's sort of take, make, waste, or excuse me, make, take, waste sort of flow of materials and of products. And the circular economy is really trying to not have it be so linear, but bring things back into the economy, back into the system, so that we're not wasting our waste. And another thing about our economic activity that has been pretty basic in the past is that we have been running off an assumption that we exist in a world with infinite resources, and we just know that that is not true. That's we live in a world of very finite resources, and even when we talk about things like renewable resources and non-renewable resources, there's some little caveats in there too, because even if a resource is renewable, that can be dependent upon certain types of conditions, certain contexts. You know, the sun is considered a renewable resource, but there are areas of the world where it doesn't get a lot of sun for certain times of the year, and so you know there's certain sort of caveats there with different resources. And so I'm a little bit before we get to that, I just want to share, I tend to be pretty evasive when it comes to certain definitions and real hard and fast definitions of things, because particularly when we talk in a space of sustainability and a space of circular economies and things like that, a lot of the definitions, while we can all sort of look at this definition and maybe agree that this is how we're defining circular economy, there are lots of other people in the world who rely on other definitions of this, or who have other assumptions and interpretations of what this term means. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when in this space, because there are a lot of terms and definitions that can be confusing, that can be misleading, that can be used. I'm not sure if, presumably we're familiar with the term greenwashing in this space, where a lot of companies, it's just the idea that a lot of companies will say that they're doing things sustainably or say that they're doing things circularly, and they're not actually doing that. And so it paints this picture that they're doing these green things, but they're not actually doing it. And so there can be a lot of opportunities, but there's also a lot of challenges that we deal with in this space. So for ease of conversation and for talking about this concept, the principles, again, I'm relying on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation principles. This can be different depending on the source that you're looking at and where you're how you're looking at circular systems. But some general principles of the circular economy is that to first design out waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use, and also to regenerate natural systems. And so it's not just about utilizing materials in a more efficient way, but it's about also actively then contributing to the regeneration of these systems that are being depleted. Because it's one thing to just stop using a material. It's another thing to help to regenerate the conditions that that sort of created that that condition of the environment. And so those are some of the principles of the circular economy. And again, I'm not sure if you all have seen these kinds of sort of graphics before, but the linear economy tends to, again, take resources and materials, use them, and then dispose them. And we do have, we have some recycling of certain types of materials that are, sometimes more standard than others in certain places. And so there is that happening currently in a linear economy, but what a circular economy is trying to do is basically flip those kinds of thick and thin arrows so that the majority of what we're using is going back to the system rather than having it essentially be buried or end up in our oceans and things like that. So again, I've provided these clicks as active hyperlinks so that you'll be able to look at these more if you would like to get into that. But I'd like to sort of have some time for some questions afterwards and things. And so that's why we're going to go through these a little bit on the fast side. And again, this is, I'm not going to go through each part of this visual, but it's again just to show sort of some ways of how the circular system can look in terms of the materials. If you look at the top, how we're mining our materials, how we're like not just mining, but how we're sourcing our materials, how they're being used and how they can go back into the system. You can see there's some examples of how that can, how those can go back. So, you know, you all can look at some of these different graphics and these information, but what I was really wanting to sort of get into today, and again, this is another another helpful tool and visual to see sort of how we can look at the different ways of incorporating circular systems through rethinking what we do, reducing our materials, redesigning certain things, reusing. This right here is a list of 6 R's. Others rely on 4, some have 9. There's different kinds of things that we can look at here. And so there's, again, I'm a little evasive when it comes to some of these things because there are different people and organizations and institutions that use sort of different combinations of things, but it's the circular economy is all sort of about having waste be used as a material, but also incorporating that into not just using our materials, but thinking about how it continues in our economies even after we are gone. And so it's important to consider several different areas of material flows in a circular economy. And so again, I sort of wanted to utilize this space to not just sort of go over definitions and terms and things like that, but as an opportunity for you all to sort of look at how does this look in a real world situation in our lives. And so I encourage you all to just sort of take a moment to look at the labels of your clothing that you're wearing right now, or whatever you've got in your house or whatever, and just sort of take a look at it and see what it's made of. And it's probably, I mean, feel free to, I don't know if you want to write in the chat or anything like that, but you can see that there is probably a mixture. Let's see if I minimize, I'm not sure, I can't see the chat right now. Okay, well, I'm not sure, for some reason I can't see the chat. So but probably what you have, my guess is that you have likely a combination of things: cotton, wool, polyester, nylon, acrylic, rayon, different things. There's lots of different types of material. And now some of these materials are natural materials, things like cotton, things like wool, hemp, silk, linen, stuff like that. Those are natural materials. Yep. And so we've got a good breakdown here of cotton, polyester, spandex, things like that, because there are also synthetic materials, things like polyester, spandex, nylon, stuff like that. And so out of curiosity, we already heard from one person today about a shirt that was eaten, unfortunately, by moths. And so how would you all discard clothing? Would you put it in the trash can? Would you put it in a compost bin? As the student shared earlier, certain compost bins can take certain things like this, certain compost bins cannot. There's also, donation is something that we could do. Yep, throwing away or donating if it's in good shape. Donation, yep, that's great. And donating is wonderful. I don't want to at all say that donation is a bad thing, but what the circular economy is about is basically looking at that and saying, okay, well, at some point, that shirt is not going to be able to be used anymore. And if you donate it, yes, you can reuse it for things like, I tend to use old clothing for like cleaning rags and stuff like that. And that's great. It's a great way to reuse it. But what happens, something has to happen to it at some point where we can no longer reuse it as something. And so then, okay, then where does it go? What happens to it? And the tricky thing is that for something like 100% cotton shirt, in theory, yes, you can compost that, or a wool material, but a lot of times things are blended together. As we saw at a couple of the examples, there are blended fabrics of polyester and cotton together, spandex and cotton together. And that makes it far more difficult then to be able to reuse those materials because they are blended and connected together. And so that makes it very difficult if you're thinking about it circularly. How do we separate out those materials? How do we use those in other ways? Because yes, you can do things with them to reuse them and to sort of extend their life from going into a landfill. But at some point, where does it go? What do we do with it? And so the destinations that these materials go, and I'm just using sort of clothing here as an example, but the destinations of these types of materials, whether it's clothing or whether it's your Starbucks cup that has a plastic lid and a paper cup, but it's got plastic lined on the inside, but then a cardboard sleeve, all of these types of things, when we think about these types of products, the more materials that are involved in a type of product, the harder it is going to be to then separate out those materials and reuse them in different ways. If you're thinking about them, farther and farther down on this hierarchy level. And so this is, I just listed out on the left here. There's, the destinations of how we use these materials are going to depend on several different things, like the quality of that material. If there's moths who have eaten through this cloth or not, that's going to change whether we can either, rent that out to somebody, or if we have to then really let it go. The composition, whether it's a blended material or not, the capabilities of our equipment, of our infrastructure, things like that. All of these have something, can change where on this hierarchy they would go and how they would be reincorporated back into the economy. Also, style is a thing. I mean, luckily with fashion, that kind of comes back around right after certain years, but it can be, that may seem like sort of a frivolous thing, but that's something that needs to be considered, because that's something that we as a society care about. And so those kinds of things need to be considered. It's not just a matter of practicality or function. Part of me really wishes that it was, but I come from a background of marketing. There are ways in which we have to be considerate of people's individual preferences and how we frame things, because it's not nothing, it matters. And even something as easy as the color of a bin can make a big difference in terms of actions and behaviors and how we are able to sort of respond to what we're wanting to do. So I wanted to also share another example, and I'm sticking with the clothing theme just to keep it easier. But one of my students in my circular economies course shared this company that sounded really cool. It says, if you see, I rewrote what it says on the end here because it's a little bit difficult to read, but it says, this sneaker is made from grape leather and the sole is made from recycled rubber. It is circular in production and design. And that sounds really great, right? We're using grape leather. I believe this company is in Italy. They have a lot of waste from their wineries, a lot of grape waste. And so awesome that they're able to use this. But is this really circular? It might be, I guess, a sustainable way of reusing materials. And that's great, because that's part of of one of the principles of circular design is reusing, sort of reincorporating waste back into our streams and using that. However, if you'll notice, it says in production and design. Now, that's not the end of the story. Those aren't the only phases that are involved in an economy. And so when we look at something like this, it sounds really great. And I don't want to like hate on this company or anything like that. I'm just using them as an example. But there are other areas to think about, particularly when we're talking about the circular economy, that it's not just about the resources and the materials that we use and designing them to use waste products. You also have to think about the design of the end of life, right? I'll use another example of a friend of mine got me a gift from 4Ocean. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that organization, 4Ocean. They take trash from the ocean and use that material to make things like bracelets and other things to sort of increase awareness and everything of the ocean. Now, I would be shocked if, I mean, we're all aware of the ocean, the plastic in our oceans, right? I mean, to me, awareness is sort of a silly target if that's the goal of this, because we're all sort of aware of plastic in our oceans. The big problem that I have with that organization, and again, I don't want to hate on organizations that are, doing better than the status quo, but it is worth being critical in our thinking about, okay, well, what's actually happening here? Because if we're taking trash from the ocean and converting it into a bracelet, the bracelet has 3 different materials. So it's got the plastic beads, they're clear plastic beads that are on a plastic string, and then there's a metal logo of 4Ocean. And so that's 3 different materials that would require 3 different processes to be able to process and reuse and remanufacture. Plus, something like a bracelet, that doesn't last for very long. Something like a bracelet is easy to break, and then you have a bunch of little beads all over the place. Is that really the best use of that material? Because it can be a trendy thing, like all the Live Strong bracelets and everything that sort of come out, and these trends tend to happen. And oh, it's cool, you can signal your awareness and all of that stuff. But is it really, is it really solving the problem, and is it really reaching the goal of what it's trying to do? We have to be thinking about this holistically and fully through these different stages, because it's not just about reutilizing materials and waste materials. It's about, okay, how do we keep it going into our system and into our economies? And that's really, it's tricky, because that takes extra effort, that takes extra time to be able to think about it past when it goes out of your line of sight, right? And how it's involved in the rest of its stages. And so there are some things. Let's see, what do we have next here? Oh, yep. It's not just about using waste materials. These kinds of economies is really about looking at full systems and a systems thinking kind of a way, where things need to be designed, again, not only to reuse materials and to use materials that are from waste products, but designing for resilience, to be able to have that system be self-repairing, and designing also for self-organizations, which is another sort of term for having the ability to structure itself. And so the more that we can have these kinds of economies and systems basically be like self-sustaining, self-sufficient, then that's going to make it easier. It's more work on the front end to try to design, but it's a worthwhile investment to make sure that these things keep going, and that we can continue sustaining these operations, rather than, oh, it sustains it for a little bit, but then after a while it doesn't, you still sort of have the same problems. So some ways of being able to implement circular economies is through either substitution of materials or dematerialization. And so that's sort of, these are fancy words of basically saying you can either switch out one material for another material or multiple types of materials, or dematerialize is basically just using less of a material. And actually, I'd forgotten that I put on as an example here, the Woola company that I put in the chat, using wool, and an important caveat of their organization is that they're actually using the wasted wool instead of like wool that would be used for clothing. It's the other the wool waste byproducts, to be able to use sort of this bubble wrap packaging and sleep envelopes and things like that. But there's other things like paper that are really cool. There's like mycelium that's being used for packaging. There's all sorts of kinds of really cool things that can be done for different kinds of materials. But it does require some creative thinking. It requires us to sort of step out of looking at the very cheapest option. And unfortunately, a lot of times sustainability and circularity, those terms become synonymous with expensive, which is really a sad thing, because it doesn't have to be that way. Depending on what we're talking about, it can actually be far more economically efficient to be able to use our waste products, because it costs us money to discard our waste. We don't really think about it because it's not something that's really negotiable. When you're in an apartment or in a house, you can't really negotiate your waste pickup. That's just something that you have to pay for that the city provides. But there are ways that's actually costing us money as individuals. It costs companies a lot of money to discard their waste at an organizational level. And oftentimes when companies look at trying to maximize their efficiencies and minimize inefficiencies, waste doesn't get involved in that conversation. It's just sort of assumed that that's a cost of doing business, and that's just the way that it is, and you have to factor that into the books. But that's not how it has to be. There's really great opportunities to be able to reincorporate those things, and that can either be done through sort of outsourcing and having markets for companies to basically take waste products and move it around, or companies can choose to vertically integrate certain things. I think the wastewater treatment facility here is similar to, there's a lot of the wastewater treatment facilities have realized that the waste byproducts that they're filtering out of wastewater is just a fancy it's a way to use as fertilizer. The difference between poop and fertilizer is just in how we frame it. It's the same thing, but it's just in how we market it and how we frame it. And so it's the same thing with these other kinds of products. I think there's a lot of opportunities with marketing and how these resources are managed to be able to reshape some of our thinking on how these materials can be used. So I want to also just chat for a minute also about these different terminologies. So things like reusable, recyclable, disposable, biodegradable, compostable. I put edible on here too, because I was using this example of cutlery. So if you'll see the metal cutlery that we're sort of used to using at home, that's reusable. The sort of blue one here in the middle, in theory, if that's a certain type of reusable plastic or recyclable plastic, then you could do that. Disposable plastic, most of the cutlery, the plastic cutlery that we have is not recyclable, and so it needs to be discarded. But there's things like bamboo that can be biodegradable, also like other types of sort of wood and materials that are biodegradable and compostable. There's also cutlery that can be edible. So the one, if you see on the bottom right here, there's certain types of processes where you can look at some of these are using like sugarcane byproducts. Some of these are using different grain byproducts and stuff like that. There's a lot of different companies out there doing really cool things, but it's worth noting that things like recyclable and compostable, they're only going to be effective if we have the infrastructures in place to be able to do that. Oftentimes, if you think about the like solo cup kind of things that are made with corn that are advertised as compostable, that's great. But if it looks like plastic and people are then throwing it in the recycle bin, that's not good. And also, if it's only compostable via industrial composting, where it needs a stronger kind of system that has higher temperatures and more aeration to be able to process than, say, your backyard compost, that's going to be different too. And we need to have the infrastructures in place for that. And so I think it's worth noting that, again, I don't want to sound overly critical of these kinds of things, but the way that I see it is, if we're going to go ahead and try to be better and do better, like, let's go all the way with it. Because when I see ads from Gillette that say, hey, we're no longer having plastic packaging, aren't we great? Well, the whole the product itself is plastic. So, like, you went through the effort to redesign your packaging away from plastic, but then you didn't do the product itself. That, to me, is an example of greenwashing, because they're acting like they're doing something great, which, okay, yes, that's better than nothing, but that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be critical of these kinds of things and push them to go a little bit further with how they're looking at their materials. And so I think we're coming up close, or I'm not sure timing wise, I forget when I started, but I do want to leave room for some questions and things. I had put as a local example, Plant Chicago. I then saw that it was already on y'all's resource list of local of a local option. But I recently moved here. I've been here for I guess about five months or so now, and so I'm still learning myself. I'm happy to connect with you all and to learn about some other things that are going on here locally in Chicago, because I'm very interested to find out some local things. But I figured it was worth putting back on there, because they're really like an incubator space for circular businesses, and that's a pretty cool resource to be able to have. There's also the Searle Biodiesel Lab here on Loyola's campus that is a cool operation that is basically taking cooking oil, not only from campus, but also from local restaurants, from, I believe, also the Shed Aquarium, different places. And they are processing that here on campus, actually just in the building where my office is, and converting that into renewable biodiesel fuel that our campus shuttle uses. And what's neat is that, like, that alone to me is a pretty neat thing to be able to use a waste product for that purpose. But also a byproduct of that processing also creates soap. And so that's used not only here in this building or in the sustainability buildings on campus, but also down in the Water Tower campus, and all of our campuses use that, the soap that is processed and produced by our students here on campus. And so that's a really cool thing to be able to sort of utilize multiple byproducts. So not only fat, oil, and grease waste, but also the byproduct from that process to use yet another thing. It just highlights a lot of opportunities there from different byproducts. There's also a student startup that started up last year of an app that students can use here on campus called Loop to facilitate clothing reuse and recycling there. So it's for students, it's by students. Unfortunately, it's only you have to have a Loyola email address to be able to access it. So unfortunately, unless you are a Loyola student, that you won't be able to do that. But I did also just sort of want to highlight that that's something that is trying to be done here on our campus to increase circularity and sustainability. But again, it's sort of worth the little fine print of saying that eventually some clothing will have to be thrown away, or not necessarily thrown away, but discarded in some form or fashion. And so that is the broader picture of circularity that needs to be considered. So some additional things, I have a YouTube channel. I have different playlists of things for various topics. And so if you're interested to sort of check out some other cool things of how waste is being used or other types of stuff, I'm also into bugs and how bugs can be used for different applications. I have mealworms in my office that have an enzyme. Mealworms have an enzyme that can break down styrofoam. So that's a pretty cool application. I also have separate ones that I eat myself because their bugs are great nutrients. And we are not leveraging that nearly enough here in this country, but there's a lot of opportunities there. Close the loop, again, to sort of be in line. Fashion is not actually my area is food, but fashion is a big topic for circular systems and sustainability, because there is so many, there are a lot of challenges there, as we talked about with blended materials and stuff. This particular website has a lot of really cool tools and stuff that I found this to be more useful for me personally than the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. There's a lot of, I think that the tools on that site are a lot more accessible and easy to use. There's also a really great book called Thinking in Systems that looks like this, but it's also the link that I've provided on here. It's a PDF of the whole book that somebody put up. I don't know how legal that is for copyright purposes, but that's somebody else who posted that. So that's not me, I'm just linking to it. But it's a really great book to be able to, it's pretty short too. It's really not very long. It's a pretty easy read, and it's a really great way to be able to start thinking in a way that's much more holistic, that really falls in line with circular systems. And in terms of getting involved, I really love this thought in this quote, because I personally believe that these kinds of things, these topics are really overwhelming. When we talk about sustainability, when we talk about circular systems, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, things like that, climate change, all of these topics are very, very heavy. They're very heavy, they're overwhelming, they're pretty daunting. And so I think it's important to remember that, okay, if we're trying to change the whole world, that's going to be really difficult if that's the framing that we're doing. But I think it's important to remember that while we can't control others, we can try to influence them and everything. But what we can control is what we do personally ourselves. And I say that not to put the weight of the world on each of us as individuals, because that's not very fair. And we have to be mindful of how we manage our own. There's some term of like eco guilt or something like that with what we're doing in our own lives. And so I don't share this to try to, make us all feel guilty about what we're doing or what we're not doing, because we're all just out here doing the best we can. And that's great. But, what we do have control over is what happens in our own household, what happens in our own workplaces, what happens in our own, well, to an extent, our own workplaces, but, our neighborhoods, our communities, our places of worship, where we go and shop, stuff like that. We do have control over what we do, what we choose to do. That certain things can take a lot of privilege to be able to do that and make those choices. But it's important to try to do what we can in our own realms. And, ripples have an effect. And if we all sort of do what we can do, then that can make a big difference. And so my, suggestions is just building communities and working together and trying to expand these ideas out as much as possible. So hopefully I didn't go over time, and we have some time for questions or something, but yeah, I'd love to hear from you all, and feel free to reach. I believe all my contact information is at the start of this the presentation. I'm also very easy if you just Google me to find and all of that. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to get together with any of you all for, coffee or a drink and nerd out about sustainability and circular stuff. I'm always down for that. So reach out, let me know if you want to hang out and chat about stuff. And yeah, I would love to hear any questions or feedback that y'all have.
I had a question.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, I want to lower my hand. Is an aquaponics question.
Yes.
So I noticed you spent some time doing that. I'm wondering, because I've also I have this dream of having chickens in my backyard,
Yes.
but I don't know if that's, my wife has other plans.
You gotta look district-wise for that too. There's certain regulations, but
Yeah, we can have them in Chicago. We can't slaughter them for meat though. We can have them, you can keep them as pets or for eggs, but there's this like, I've seen things about people getting black soldier fly larvae
yes,
and like composting with
yes,
those and then feeding those to chickens.
yes.
Would that work for aquaponics as well, like fish food?
Absolutely. So black soldier fly larvae, it's funny you bring that up because that's actually what I started out researching, was looking at food and insects for human consumption. But I went to a conference back in 2018 in Wuhan, China, before everybody heard about that on the map. But I went to a conference and it was called Insects to Feed the World. And first off, awesome that there's a whole conference about that. But second off, what was interesting was that despite that being a conference on insects for human consumption, almost half of the presentations there were about black soldier fly larvae and how they how well they process food waste. And so there's different conditions and things like that a lot of engineering has been looking at that in terms of different systems and setups for how to do that. Yeah, those are great because they end up in your compost systems. If they're outside compost systems, they end up there whether you want them to or not. Like you don't have to inoculate your system. They just show up. They're fascinating to be able to do that. And there's been some studies that have then looked at looking at food waste put in an anaerobic digester or converting that into fuel. And actually if you just use food waste, it will produce a certain amount of fuel. But if you process black soldier fly larvae that have eaten that food waste instead, you actually get a higher yield. And so there's different, I'm not necessarily saying that that's what we should be doing with them, but it's an interesting kind of thing to see that there's applications not only for animal feed for black soldier fly larvae, but also for fuel, also for composting, lots of different applications for that particular bug, but there's lots of other things. And so aquaponics, definitely they're being used for fish meal, as well as some are putting them into, I think Purina is using them in dog treats. I'm not sure if they're using black soldier fly larvae or mealworm or some other kind, but I remember that they're using insects to supplement some of the protein in some of their food products, animal food products, excuse me.
Yeah, so follow-up question. Yeah. It seems like to me with like a soldier fly, tilapia, like greens, aquaponics system, you would have you'd need, I guess you could figure it out, but your micronutrients would be coming from the waste that you feed the soldier flies, correct? I mean, that's the only thing, because you've got carbon dioxide, you've got water, you've got light. And so the thing that you need to add into the system is micronutrients. And that would just that soldier flies can provide that, right?
I think depending on the fish and depending on what they're fed, will yield different types of nutrients. And so like if you're using black soldier fly larvae on a heterogeneous combination of food waste versus say you were only using the food waste from a coffee shop, that's going to be really different, right? And yield nutrients than if you're to use like household waste or restaurant waste. But again, restaurant waste, depending on the restaurant, can have different yields. Right. And so unfortunately, there's not like a quick and easy answer for that because it kind of depends.
I'm sorry to nerd out about it, but
no, I love it.
Maybe I will email you or something.
Sorry,
no one else. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Please reach out. Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts, feedback? I'm not sure how much time we have, so.
We still have about 3 minutes, so we have time for if anyone else has any questions. Ron?
How did you know? I was really intrigued with the Cereal Biodiesel Lab. And just wondering, like, when I kind of think about the office building I work at. I'm in the well, it used to be the IBM building. It's the AMA Plaza now,
Right.
and the restaurants in there and the oil in there. Like, how do you get that? I mean, it's interesting. I don't like using a lot of oils for like any type of pan frying or anything, because it's like I just feel guilty throwing it away.
Right.
And it's really cool to see that you have this solution, and just wondering how we can engage with that. Or
Yeah, I'm not sure how we decide the partnerships. It could be I mean, they might have a certain list that they go
Okay.
and have partnerships with the logistics of getting that. But there are also maybe limiting, I'll have to find out about that, because there may be limitations of just, there's only so much that our lab can process, right? It'd be great if we could process like all of the FOG waste in Chicago, but I don't think that's very practical. Also, I'm a big advocate for decentralizing as much processing as possible. Now, for something like FOG waste that requires really very specialized equipment, a space to be able to do that, certain permitting and everything to be able to do that. That's one thing. But in terms of things like composting, certain food waste that is coming out of, say, a big office building like AMA. To me, yes, it's great if there are, I know that there are companies around here that will, it's like a sort of a subscription-based service where you can sign up for composting and they'll come and pick it up and all of that. What I have a hard time with is that there's still a lot of carbon footprint that is happening with the transport of all of that stuff to and from. And particularly when I see organizations that are spending money on getting on a substantial amount of their trash being taken away from their facility being food waste. That's usually a very substantial amount. It can be anywhere between like 10 and 40%. And then they're spending money on that to be taken away, but then they're also spending money on fertilizer for their landscaping of, the grounds around the organization. And so they're actually paying two costs for something that they're sort of producing on site. And so now not every office building is going to be able to have like an in-vessel composter or a processing facility on site, but there are small scale ways that we can do that and decentralize things much more so than just relying on a centralized facility that everything goes to and from. I have started a vermicomposting bin here in my office to try to help to demonstrate that this kind of thing is possible on a small scale. I mean, I'm not the first to do that. There's lots of people doing that, but it really, there's a lot of stigmas around certain things with that kind of a thing. And I'm sure you all have gone over the NIMBY syndrome of not in my backyard. That's a big scenario that happens with these kinds of conversations. But when done properly, these kinds of things they don't smell, they don't have rats in them. If you're doing things properly, there's lots of ways that you can make sure that these kinds of things are done well. And so certain things like converting FOG waste is going to be difficult to decentralize and have all over the city or all over an urban space, but other things like composting and stuff can very easily be done. Actually, it just takes effort and education on how to do that.
Thank you. It's inspirational.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. I know that a couple other people had questions. Unfortunately, we have a very tight schedule tonight. So Sarah, we'll share your contact information in our follow-up email. And do you mind if we pass along some questions to you that are?
Yeah, sure. I see there's a question in the chat about industrial composting here in Chicago, and I'm happy to, I don't want to take the other speaker's time. So I'm happy to, if you have a list of questions from the class, then I'm happy to sort of maybe address that instead of everybody individually, and I can then go out to the class for your next session or something.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate your presentation. I know I learned a little bit, so I'm always excited to hear from presenters and hear about new circular economy systems in Chicago I hadn't heard about before. So
All right, well, thank you all so much for inviting me, and I hope to meet some of you all in person.